So it starts with we don't yet know the universe is open or closed. More than that, there are a few astronomers who doubt that the redshift distant galaxies is due to the Doppler effect, who are skeptical of the expanding universe and the Big Bang. Perhaps our descendants will regard our present ignorance with as much sympathy as we feel to the ancients for not knowing the Earth went around the sun. If the general picture, however, of a Big Bang followed by the expanding universe is correct, what happened before that? Was the universe devoid of all matter and then the matter suddenly somehow created? How did that happen? In many cultures, the customary answer is that a god or gods created the universe out of nothing. But if we wish to pursue this question courageously, we must of course ask the next question: where did God come from? If we decide that this is an unanswerable question, why not save a step and conclude that the origin of the universe is an unanswerable question? Or if we say that God always existed, why not save a step and conclude that the universe has always existed? Now, I came upon this, as I said, many different projects, and it's from Carl Sagan's Cosmos series. I'm not sure if you recognize it from your boyhood,
Yeah.
but this is a sentiment that I see in many of your poems and in your prose, and yet it seems to me almost as if you rendered it a lot better than Carl Sagan did. So I want to talk to you about the idea of originality versus greatness, and more importantly, how originality is often overrated. For even if we grant that this is the first time this idea popped out, which it wasn't, it is not as well rendered as the many versions that you've stated it, and you've also shaped it around different ideas too and given it more depth.
Well, just before I answer the artistic portion, personally, one of the things that I did an interview with four people who are not Big Bang believers, and I think one of the things that even if you don't know a damn thing about physics or basic logic or reasoning, if you just look at the history of scientific thought, we're clearly not even close to understanding a lot of big picture things. So the idea that the Big Bang is where everything started is clearly going to turn out to be false. There's something that's going to overturn it, whether it's modified Newtonian dynamics, which helps to explain a lot of the things on a subgalactic level that we see with so-called dark matter or dark energy. Apparently, a lot better. I've only read a few papers about it, so I don't know the ins and outs of it. But regarding originality in art or originality in poetry or writing, more specifically, um, originality is good to a certain degree. But then you get people who fetishize originality as something positive in and of itself. The best example I can give is if you go on Cosmoetica, or if you Google up the name Bob Grumman, back in the early O's, this was a fellow who uh, came up with what he thought was an original poetic form called Mathemaku, where basically he'd have use mathematical formulae and he'd have anywhere from 3 to 6, 7, 8 words in either a divisor form or this equals that divided by thing. It's like shit. The square root of shit divided by 3 equals the sum of your penis. And this is what he thought would be deep or whatnot. And I had to point out to him there were people like Wilfred Watson in Canada, and there were lots of other smaller guys that he didn't know of, and that I didn't know have any books, but that I
Bill
would meet.
Bissett.
What?
Bill Bissett as well.
Bill
And
Bissett's
E.
another.
Cummings also did similar things.
Yeah, but his claim to fame was, I'm the first one to use divisors in poetry. Well, it's not poetry. I think Alex Sheremit had once said that even if you were to write out shit, the square root of shit divided by whatever equals, even if you write it out, it's got the intellectual content of a typical third grader's farts. So it, even if I were to grant someone like a Grumman uh, originality, so what? His thoughts were puerile. His
And
his his
are we
way.
making a distinction between originality and individuation? Because if you have a poet like Walt Whitman who kind of stands against and is the sum of everything that came before him, that's so individuated and so original that it reshapes the whole form. Whereas Bob Grumman or Bill Bissett or Wilfred Watson, these are not necessarily original in themselves, first of all. But even if they were original, they don't do anything with it to sustain any arguments for greatness.
Well, yeah, and greatness again is something that a better example than originality is the idea of perfection versus greatness. And I told you this with my poem Congolian Footfalls or other. There are numbers of poems that I could look at, not only by me, but by other people that you could say are perfect in their certain kind of way. There are a number of haikus, famous haikus by Basho, that are perfect little gems, say. And you could argue they're a great haiku, uh, but or some of the Chinese poets would have 5, 6, 7, 8 lines of something that's a perfect little evocation of a moment, but not necessarily great. Um, Perfection just means that you can't do something more than what it is. It has reached its limits. But if you have something that whose limits is this much and greatness is a beach ball size, well, something that reaches, for example, on a scale of 1 to 100, if 100 equals the ultimate that you can do in a field, and if you're doing something that's a little askew, but it can only get to 75, well, if you reach 75 out of 75, that's as perfect as you can get in that endeavor. But there are endeavors at 76, 77 through 100, or perhaps even higher, arguably, and so clearly that wouldn't necessarily reach a level of greatness. You can see this more easily in sports. You can have someone, for example, in professional basketball, who you could say is a perfect free throw shooter, who let's say gets to the free throw line in a professional season 100 times, hits 100 free throws. So he's great at doing that, and you could say that he's a great free throw shooter and he's perfect at that. But there's a far cry from saying he's a perfect basketball player. Excuse me. This is one of the things. These are these kinds of definitional things that many people mix up: originality, perfection, greatness. Greatness is going to have a depth. You're going to have skill. You have to have technical skill, to be great. But greatness also requires something else. The best example of this, I've said many times, I may have said it to you previously, Walter Delamere. If you want to look at a poet who technically, in terms of sound wise, and even if you buy into the bullshit of meter, Delamere comes as close to perfect meter as you can, as long as you're willing to accept the binary. Yes, I could go through his poem, and if you were to listen to it, you could still hear four or five syllabic differences in strength in a 10 or 11 syllable line. But he's as close to metrical perfection as one could claim. But so what? If you ever read the poems of Walter Delamere, they are beautiful little nothings. They are doilies. They don't do anything deeper. They don't go, you compare a Walter Delamere to someone like maybe a Stephen Crane who was around the same era. Stephen Crane was not a great poet. You could argue maybe he wrote some great short stories or maybe a great novella or two. The Red Badge of Courage is the most famous thing. But he wrote maybe about 100 of his famous lines, usually anywhere from 4 to 8, 9, 10 lines that were prosaic lines. There's no meter or anything, but there's an odd kind of poetry. But Crane was a much more original and much better writer, even in his lines, than Delamere, for all of his perfection in all of his poetry was. And
In a
so,
previous conversation, too, we talked about how a poem can be, even though it's flawed, it can be greater than a perfect poem that is also great. Walt Whitman is a good example in that his poetry has a lot of breadth to it. It expands into many different ideas. Whereas if you compare it to, say, a sonnet, even if it's a perfect sonnet, the sonnet is not going to get at the same level that a 50-page poem is going to do. So, Song of Myself is really one of the most incomparable poems that you can have. It expands too much. It does have flaws in it. All of Walt Whitman's poems have flaws, but there's a strength in the excess, and there's a strength to the flaws that, even though it can never be a perfect poem, it is non-pareil in terms of greatness.
yeah, and I just finished writing today a book review, and you can't see it, but I'm holding up a book. It's called Concho by Denzel Holmes. Jessica and I were at this arts fair a couple of weekends ago in a Texas town, and I saw this fellow. He was had a stand and he was selling his books, and I asked him, "Let me buy your best book." He's probably 75, 80 years old. He started writing when he retired, and I read the book, and I recently wrote a Western book, and uh, his book is just absolutely flat. It has predictable things. It doesn't have that many overt cliches, but by the same token, there's nothing that enlivens it. And I end the review saying, a critic has to ask, why did this person feel that they needed to share this information with the world? I mean, the story as it's told has been told so many times in old Western serials, in Western five and dime novels going back 130, 140 plus years. And again, it's not a terrible book. It's actually better than anything that a David Foster Wallace or a Dave Eggers or a Thomas Pynchon ever wrote. And I would argue that, against any MFA hack who wanted to talk about it. Like I said, I had a guy who was a critic who didn't, a few weeks ago that I interviewed, that was trying to make a case for Foster Wallace as a great writer. This Denzel Holmes is a better writer, but he's not a particularly good writer. I think I gave the book ultimately a 60 out of 100. So it fails by a little bit. The first half is okay, solid, and then the second half just tanks because nothing ever happens. But that's a good example of someone here. This is a book that could have had a lot of subversions if someone had a more original mind. You could have taken a lot of the dramatic setups, a lot of the characterizations, and you could subvert things. You could subvert a lot of the Western tropes. You could have expanded and made it a deeper novel beyond just the Western. And this is one of the things that genre writers don't do, because in order to be a genre, for example, a Western book has to be set in the west of America, usually within the 19th century, after Lewis and Clark and before the closing of the West, the Indian massacres at the end of the 19th century. It has to have cowboys, it has to have Indians and or banditos and or the U.S. cavalry or army. It has to be set somewhere west of the Mississippi. Usually Oregon and Washington aren't considered part of the West. So the Pacific Northwest is generally out. So it's California to Texas, basically, and whatnot. But in order to satisfy whatever the genre is, people do these same things, but they never go beyond. And it's amazing when you read these books, and whether it's a romance book, a spy thriller, a detective book, a Western, a horror genre, or whatnot. Why do these people do these same things? And it's the question that gets back to originality. Is most of these people don't have that impulse. They don't have that demiurge to push. You have to push. When I'm writing something, like yesterday, for example, I was working on this spy book of mine, and out of the blue, I was writing. Let me think. I was doing a chapter, and I was writing about. I was writing about. It was a chapter where my spy character in the late 1990s, after a 20-year legal battle, the government finally bought some of the lands from the Howard Hughes estate. And in my earlier book, A Norwegian in the Family, Howard Hughes plays a character who may or may not be part of this syndicate called the Foundation. And he's wandering around this very James Bondian-like home base that Hughes has built into the side of a butte in Arizona or Nevada. And he's wandering around and he's talking about, and then he's talking about how the government found these tapes of where Hughes was interviewing people to play his stand-in, his double. And I went off on a whole riff about this guy, this fictional character who spent the last 15 or so, 20 years of his life playing Howard Hughes for public appearances. And it's one of those things that just came out of the writing. I had said, I think the last time we talked, how sometimes you just write and the things will flow out of it. There's how you can get something original that comes out of nowhere. I had no idea that I was going to have this in the book. Yet, speaking of Keats and negative capability, it fits in perfectly with the book, because the book is a series of it's 27 chapters, and it's incidents in this spy's life, and each of them is sort of like a banner hung down, and the banner starts to fray at the end. And this is a guy who is just remembering all these things, and the reader is going to have to put them together because they're not in a chronological order, but they make sense because they intuitively leap from segment to segment. A book like this Concho, which I'm holding up that you can't see though, this fellow Holmes, nice guy, I'm sure, but he doesn't have that. And so originality can be overrated, but real originality, like the ability to go from writing about one thing and then all of a sudden, literally in a split second, say, oh, here's where I can go. He's gonna stumble upon some canisters of screen tests that Hughes had done for people to play him, and then a whole story unfolds within the context of a much larger story. And
And like, say, a formal rhyme poem or one of these other structures of poetry, like, say, a banal or something, that you are using the form to serve the function of the tale. So instead of using it as a restriction, like genre tropes, you're using it to expand the character and give him more depth rather than simply conforming to the tropes that have mired many of these genre books in the past.
yeah, well, like in this Wesson book, this fellow wrote, if I had written that book, if let's say someone said, "Yeah, Dan, we're gonna give you an opportunity. We're gonna test your writing ability. You could take this rather average, pretty much middle of the road Western novel, and how could you make it deeper?" Well, the first thing I would do is, as I said, it's always better to get behind the character's eyes than to look at what color they are. You have to get into the character because even the dumbest person is going to have a rumination. If you watch someone, let's say if you're at a shopping mall, or if you're in a store, maybe it's a bargain bin thrift store, and you watch someone, you always uh, I'm always there. Well, why? It's interesting how me and this person are in this same area, in the same portion of the world at the same time. Where did they come from? Do they have a wife? Did they suffer a stroke? Is their brother-in-law gay? Did their father beat them? Did they go to high school, or did they go to college? Are they religious or whatnot? Oh, look, he's holding up an old shirt that has Boston Bruins insignia on it. Is he from Boston originally? These things, these little moments.
Similarly, if you are in a grocery store or if you are in a line up at some kind of restaurant, then you may notice how people do the same things differently. And you'll use
Yeah.
those as differentiating characteristics and maybe as an into a memory or something or a scene that you can play off of.
Yeah, I remember, I just thought about this yesterday, and I've thought about it a handful of times. I remember the first memory that I have of having a memory. I remember I was about 5 or 6, possibly 7, but I think it was probably 6 years old. So this was probably around 1971. It must have been summertime, I believe. I got up maybe around 6:30 in the morning, and on one of the local, I think, independent stations in New York, then they were rerunning the old Fleischer Popeye cartoons. They used to have them on time. These were the actually well-made Popeye cartoons, not the shitty ones from the 1950s. Well, anyway. But so, and I believe it was Popeye meets Sinbad the Sailor. So it was one of these 20-minute one-reeler cartoons. Most cartoons in the 30s, 40s, 50s were 5 or 6 minutes. This was one that was an epic for its age, 22, 24 minutes or whatever had been. But I remember seeing that and saying, oh yeah, I remember that from maybe a year ago. Maybe I was 4.5 when I had last seen that. And I remember remembering the first time I saw it. So my memory of the first time I ever saw that cartoon is captured within my second memory of having that first memory. So it's my first memory of having a memory of a memory. And this is the way you get that little Russian doll effect. And you can take any banal scene and you can twist it like that. Famously, Alfred Hitchcock, and it's been attributed to a few other people, maybe Otto Preminger, but it was either Hitchcock or maybe Otto Preminger who said that you can have 5 of the dullest people in the world sitting in a room bullshitting, just talking about, oh, James, I went to the bookstore yesterday and I read about Anthony Trollope. But you can take these dilettantes, and if you let the reader or the viewer know that underneath the floorboards is a hidden corpse, that changes everything going around, because you as the viewer now have a knowledge about something that the characters don't. And while that can be overdone in genre, especially spy thrillers or crime stories or whatnot, the fact that you as the reader are going to be in on something that the main character or characters are not is a very good trope to draw someone in, because you're right, even there you're working at a double level. There's the diegetic reality that the characters are a swim in, and then there's the larger reality that you know of that they don't. So you can have a character that doesn't understand why they're drawn to the works of a certain artist, or why they're revulsed by that woman that they work with who gives her a sneer. But the reader can see the undertow that the characters can't. And that creates a tension between the diegetic and the non-diegetic realities. And you can be talking about the most stupid things, like in this Western novel, for example. They go off on 4 or 5 chapters worth where one of the main characters has a handful of his horses stolen, either by the Comanches or by this bandito from Mexico, and they go after it, and they just go around and they go around and they go around, and it's just an excuse to have them talk a little bit about some of the areas of Western Texas, but nothing deeper happens. And it would be so easy to add even just one extra layer if earlier on something had been set up about a character doing this, that, or the other thing. There are many techniques that you could use to subvert, or not even subvert, but bolster up and add layering to these kinds of scenes, whether in a film or whether in a written work of art. But many people can't do that. Partly it has to do with a lack of originality. Most people simply don't think this way. This is one of the things that you have to admit. Most people could not ever be even a mediocre artist, much less a great artist. They can't think these ways. But that's why it's incumbent upon great artists too, as Whitman said, provide the means, and I forget the exact phrase, but a great artist must call or bring forth a great audience. You have to. This is why I do these videos, to explain some of these things, as to if you want to know why, for example, if you read a book, and you can pick any famous book, and why you're drawn to this kind of character, it's probably because there is something that has that undertow, that the writer sets something up. Now, a lot of times, a lot of people at surface level, people who read 50 Shades of Grey, this doesn't operate on that sphere. It's just, oh, this is groovy. I have a fantasy. This is the difference between puerile art and real adult art. But the great art will have these things. Originality can be a part of that, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a part of that.